Hey everybody, welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode. We're talking about gray drinking, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but I want to begin with a question for you. Have you been drinking more during this pandemic? Let's be honest. I'll be honest. The answer for me is yes, and in fact, you're not alone. I'm not alone. A recent study showed that 41%, that is how much more women have been drinking during this COVID pandemic. But how do you know when it becomes a problem? How do you know when you've crossed the line into it being just too much? Our guest today is the outpatient medical director for DePaul Treatment Centers. Dr. Eowyn Rieke joins us live right now to talk about gray drinking. Dr. Rieke, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I'm curious about the term gray drinking. It's new to me, but it has a very specific idea behind it. Can you help define it for us?
Sure. Gray drinking is the idea of a person who may be drinking out of control, but not to the extent where it's obvious necessarily to them or to their friends and family. For example, the person who may drink only on the weekends and feels comfortable with their drinking level, but the day after a drinking episode, they don't feel well because of the amount they drank. And so as a result, they can't perform their regular duties or responsibilities or just can't have the social life they want to have during that day when they may have what we think of as a hangover. Another example might be the mom who has the experience of, I can't get through this day without a glass of wine because their kids are homeschooling, because their house is a mess, for the many, many reasons that have come up during COVID. And that person may gradually increase from, say, 1 drink a day to 2 drinks a day. And then they may want to stop or may want to reduce their alcohol intake and may have trouble doing that. So they don't have the kind of alcohol condition where we think of someone needing to go to withdrawal management called detox or go to formal treatment, but they're drinking more than they want to, or they're drinking in a way that negatively affects their lives.
That is a great definition. And, you know, it's interesting because as I went to go post about this topic in various places on Oregon Live, who we do the show in partnership with, thanks for everybody who's turning in live, people had a lot to say about this. You know, there were people that said the mommy wine culture is so pervasive and so sad. We're teaching our kids that mommy needs wine in order to deal with them. That's from Steph on Instagram. Crystal on Instagram was saying, yes, please, let's talk about this. Alcohol, especially functioning alcoholics, closet alcoholics, such a huge problem. Let's talk about the social acceptance or the pressure for women to drink everywhere they go. Target, OMSI, out to lunch, the playground, constantly posting on social media. It's 11:35 a.m., too early for wine. It's a big problem that's ignored, according to Crystal, because society loves to focus on homeless drug users and not the ones who are working behind the counter. Is this something that you're finding as well? I mean, is this just, you know, accepted alcoholism or the use of alcohol so pervasive in our culture?
Well, and as you mentioned in the intro, is that we have seen the incidence of drinking increasing considerably with COVID. And a particular type of drinking, which is more risky, increased more during COVID, and that's what they call drinking to cope. So again, that person who perhaps has a stressful job or their job, they're constantly worried about COVID, they go home and they have a drink to cope or to settle down from that day. That kind of drinking is the kind of drinking that is more likely to result in a formal, what we call a use disorder, or a condition that where they really lose a lot of their control over their drinking and then may need more formal treatment. And so we have certainly seen an increase in alcohol use, especially among women during the last year, and the most concerning type of alcohol use, that drinking to cope.
And I think you covered some of this as you were defining gray drinking, but Chris on Facebook wants to know, how much drinking do you consider an actual problem?
Mm-hmm. I wish I had, you know, we as human beings, we want to have like a clear, this is how we define it, because we want to know, have we stepped over the line or have we not? And the hard thing with problem drinking or with gray area drinking is there's not a definite line. Traditionally, we think of 1 drink a day on average for people in female bodies and 2 drinks a day on average for people in male bodies as the healthy limit.
Okay, can I interrupt you for a moment? When you say 1 drink a day or 2 drinks a day, are we talking about, what are we talking about in terms of the volume? Because we have some wine glasses that at home where I can practically pour half a bottle into, and you know, some might loosely define that as 1 drink.
Right, or like the 24-ounce 8% beer, which is not 1 drink.
Yeah.
Generally, 1 drink is considered a glass of wine, 5 ounces, 1.5 ounces of spirit, or 1 12-ounce regular alcohol strength beer.
Okay.
So in general, 1 for folks in a female body, 2 for folks in a male body is considered kind of the healthy limit on average. Now, if you were to drink all 7 of your weekly drinks in 1 day, that would not be healthy. That would be binge drinking, which is also is actually some of the most harmful drinking in our society. And so there's not a specific limit. It's really about your relationship to your drinking. Someone who drinks 1 drink a day and really, really wishes that they didn't because of the expense, because they're worried about their health, because perhaps alcoholism runs in their family and they're concerned that this is going to slide into that. If someone who can't control their drinking and wishes they could change it, or ends up drinking more than they expect to or they plan to, those are folks who we would consider gray drinkers. And that's the time when you might want to think about getting some more support to make a change.
That's a great definition, because I mean, and one of the things you brought up there was the cost. I mean, it really does. Like if you're drinking wine, and depending on the quality of wine you like to drink, I remember pretty close to the beginning of the pandemic, kind of joking around with my friends, because as we would walk around in neighborhoods and whatnot on the morning of recycling day, you would see entire recycling bins just full of like 20 bottles of wine, and that was clearly consumed in a week's time. And it was a very telltale sign. We were like, oh my gosh, like what is happening? And so I think there are signs of it everywhere. Some of the other questions that people wanted to know is, how do you approach somebody, let's say it's not you, so let's say it's somebody in your family or a close friend who you're starting to see the impact of drinking on. How do you begin that conversation without it turning sideways?
First, I want to acknowledge it can be a hard conversation for everyone. And if you can center yourself in your caring for that person, is that you are coming to them because you care for them, not because you think they're bad and they have to change. So if you're coming from that place of heart, I think you're more likely to be successful. And then honestly asking people, what is their experience of drinking? So this is out of a framework called motivational interviewing, which has been very successful, asking them, what do you see as the negative effects of drinking? What do you see? How do you feel the next day? How much money do you spend? Do you end up staying up later than you planned to? Like, what are the negative effects of your alcohol use? And then, do you want to change that? And if you do, what's in the way? What's making it harder to change? And then how can I help you with that? So bringing that open heart and that genuine desire to support someone, I think is very important. It's still a really hard conversation to have. I don't want to minimize that, but I think being very practical and helping the person identify their challenges and their opportunities to make a change is more likely to be successful.
And what if that person is yourself? I mean, what if there's somebody out there listening to this right now, and they're listening to the things that you're listing off as warning signs or things, indications that you might be on the verge of having an issue here. What are some first steps that somebody can take for themselves?
I think first and foremost, if there are support structures around you, family, friends who you can talk to about this, that's what I would suggest first. Some people, especially with the isolation of COVID, may not have that kind of support system. And so perhaps it's work that you want to start with on your own. Sometimes people might not feel comfortable calling that support system in. So you could start with journaling. Journal to yourself. What do I see as the negative sides of alcohol use? And journal to yourself repeatedly, because that has an impact on your brain. You will remember those negative aspects. The next time you're starting to drink, you might say, oh, hey, this reminds me I might be hungover tomorrow. I don't want to do that. Or, oh, hey, I remember the last time I drank, I ended up having more than I wanted, and I said something I wish I hadn't said. So if you can remind yourself of your personal experiences that are negative related to alcohol use, it might help you reduce your alcohol use. Or if you can tell someone you care about to help you with that. Sometimes it's, I'm going to call you after my first drink, and you're going to remind me I don't want to have a second one. Sometimes it's, I'm going to check in with you the next day, and we'll talk about what happened. So if you can call in friends and family, but also motivate your internal resources, most fundamentally, I think we need to connect more. A lot of the reason people are drinking during COVID is because we've been so isolated and so scared. And so we do that drinking to cope. So if we can be proactive about connecting with people and about doing activities that make us happy, the alcohol will be less important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense. And yet the alcohol is so attractive because it's an easy go-to, you know, at the end of the night. And a lot of times it can be a private experience that you're not really sharing with anybody. So there are some hurdles there. I would imagine that it would be hard for a lot of people to call somebody up and acknowledge like, hey, I think I might be drinking too much too often. You know, that's like, it's an admission. It's a hard one.
You have to be really vulnerable to be able to say that. And vulnerability is scary, especially these days. I mean, I hope that one of the things that we'll get out of COVID is we have this sense of shared vulnerability. Like we've all been through this collective trauma together.
Yeah.
And maybe that opens up a new pathway for communication together where we can say those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And even you can just say, man, does COVID suck? I feel like I'm drinking more. Yeah. If there are ways to put it in context where it's just like, there's this external force that's affecting us all. This is how I'm responding. And it doesn't have to be, drinking too much. It can just be, how are you coping with this? I've had a second glass of wine last night and I didn't mean to.
Right. Right. Oh, that makes total sense. You know, I'm curious, have you seen any impact as well with the legalization of marijuana? Because I know that, you know, for a lot of people, especially with the changing of laws in the last several years in our region and whatnot, and the availability of marijuana in various forms, that has become a go-to for more and more people in lieu of alcohol.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting. I looked this up just this last week, and the level of alcohol sales has not significantly changed. Now, maybe that's because the level of alcohol sales would have gone up because many of us are drinking more, and they stayed steady relative to marijuana as it was increasing. But overall, alcohol sales have not decreased significantly with the legalization of marijuana. I too would have thought that people would be using one thing or the other, like having a drug of choice and something that they used more frequently when they needed to cope or wanted to relax or be social. But the data doesn't bear that out.
Interesting. You know, what are some simple guidelines then when it comes to consumption habits? I know you mentioned, you know, the general rule as far as a drink a day or 2 drinks a day. But what are some other, you know, parameters that people can keep in mind as they imbibe?
Mm-hmm. I think the key piece, again, is about control and about impact on your life. So, for example, are you going out of your way to obtain alcohol? Let's say you've run out at home, you work out of the office, you've returned to in-person work, and you go out of your way to a liquor store to get more liquor, even though you really would rather get home faster. Or you are drinking more than planned, you have an intention of going out with friends, just having 1 or 2, you end up staying much later, you end up saying or doing things that you didn't intend to. And just any way in which a person doesn't have control. Other classic signs are if it impacts your work or your relationships. So if you're hungover and so don't go to work, or if you start to drink more during the day. If from evening drinking you become what's called a day drinker, and you drink during the day, and then even you have a morning drink called an eye opener sometimes. Those are all signs. They could be signs of behavioral changes, They also could be signs of physiologic changes in your body where it gets so used to alcohol that it can't function regularly without it. And that's a sign when things can get dangerous. In particular, people who are so used to alcohol that their body depends on it should not stop drinking all of a sudden on their own, because that can be life-threatening. So that's kind of what we think of as a more severe drinking condition, but it's what this drinking to cope and gradually increasing your drinking level can lead to in the event that people aren't able to reduce their drinking.
Forgive me because this sounds like a really simplistic question, but does your body actually develop a tolerance to alcohol so that you require more to feel the effect of it over, weeks, years?
Absolutely. Tolerance is one of the classic signs of an alcohol use disorder, is needing more to have the same effect. And as well as dependence, which is what I referred to before, is when your brain cannot function. Some people need to drink in order to feel normal, in order to not have severe shakes, not to be severely nauseous. They need to continue to drink because their body is so dependent on that chemical and their brain literally can't function without it. And what's a heartbreaker is then I see those people and they say, I want to stop. I so badly want to stop. And I might be able to get them into treatment. I might not be able to get them in treatment because we have a severe shortage of treatment beds in the state. Oregon rates in the top 5 for the 5 major substances for levels of abuse, and we're one of the ones that has the very lowest level of access to treatment. And so there are thousands and thousands of people in Oregon who want treatment to stop using different substances. And when they come and they go to their primary care provider or they go to the emergency room and they say, I want to stop doing this. This is harmful. This is scary. I don't like what it's doing to me or my family. And we often have to say, sorry, or get in line, get on the waiting list, come back next week. And folks who are in that desperate condition where they're dependent on a substance, they can't exist without it, often then they're going to go back to that substance, and it may be months to years before they come again and say, I really want to stop because of the shame and the desperation of that situation. So ultimately, we absolutely must increase our treatment availability so that when people want to stop, and that's gray drinkers or not, because some folks who are gray drinking may decide, oh, I really want to stop. Gosh, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. They also need support and may need some kind of treatment. We just don't have enough in the state.
Well, and it might sound really intimidating to somebody who is listening to this right now and says to themselves, yeah, I probably fall into that gray drinking category, but God forbid, I don't want to go into like treatment, because there's a stigma with that. I don't want to go disappear for a month and, be off the grid so I can be in recovery. Are there other options? Are there telehealth options? Is there kind of an on-ramp process that somebody could engage with, at least off the bat?
Absolutely. And honestly, I'm a primary care provider in addition to an addictions medicine specialist. I would suggest, if you feel comfortable, the very first thing is to talk to your primary care provider. They can support you with resources in your local community. They can support you with medications. There are medications that can reduce people's drinking. They reduce their craving. The one we use the most commonly is called naltrexone. It's a medication that doesn't have very many side effects at all, and literally it just reduces your interest in drinking. So it can be very effective for a lot of people. So speaking with a primary care provider who can talk to you about that option and community resources. There are also support groups. There is AA and other groups that might seem intimidating to someone who thinks, oh, those are going to be the hard drinkers. But I think going and sharing community can be incredibly powerful.
Can we go back to something you said about Oregon, being in the top 5? That's not really a distinction that I love hearing about our state in terms of the various types of substances that people abuse. Why do you think Oregon consistently ranks so high in terms of our opiate use and other substances?
Yeah, opiates, stimulants, methamphetamines, alcohol. Part of it is probably due to socioeconomics. And part of it is the lack of treatment, that if we don't have enough treatment, we're going to have more people using substances. And so it's kind of a chicken or egg situation. Hopefully with Measure 110, we're going to be able to significantly increase resources for the entire spectrum of treatment that people can engage in. But up until now, we simply have not had enough treatment available. Some substances, there's a particular history in which they came to Oregon. One of the, for example, methamphetamines came to Oregon very early and had much higher penetration into the community than other substances because it was so commonly available within the state. But with other substances, I think it's really related to the lack of treatment and the very strong stigma that people don't feel comfortable talking about treatment, even if they want to.
So are you saying that other states in the country have more treatment options available to the people who live there than Oregon?
We have the very least treatment. I believe we are ranked 49th for treatment availability in the state.
How is that possible? And how did it get that bad?
I don't know. I think probably public funding, that we don't have significant tax revenue to support significant programming like substance use treatment.
Because
it's absolutely appalling. It's such a shame.
I mean, because the problem, obviously, when we talk about the Portland metro area and the rate of homelessness and substance abuse that is rampant among people who are homeless, that is an obvious problem that needs addressing. That's a bigger issue than the topic we're dealing with on hand. But when people say things like, it's time to sweep the streets and it's time to, clean things up, that's fine. But the question is, how do you go about that problem? Because the underlying issue goes way beyond the visual blight of tents and garbage.
And first of all, there are a lot of people who are homeless who do not have substance use conditions. About 40% of people who are homeless have a significant substance use condition. Mm-hmm. And some of it, again, it's a chicken or egg situation. I have done a lot of work with people experiencing homelessness, and I don't know what I would do if I was in their condition. Some people start using meth because it's the only way they can stay up all night to be safe. They will otherwise get assaulted or have all of their gear stolen. And so they start using a substance literally for personal safety. And then they get addicted to it and they can't stop. Some people use alcohol as an escape because of the awful conditions surrounding them. So homelessness is not the only problem with substance use. Substance use is a much larger problem, especially alcohol use in our state. And the homeless are only a tiny little proportion of that. I think ultimately it's really about the lack of mental health care in our state, which is also incredibly in low supply and very difficult to access. I think it is about socioeconomics. That when people don't have money, drinking is an easy access way to get away from that stress. And I think it's the lack of treatment.
I've been in that situation on a very personal level where I've had family members who I've talked to, intervened, and have gotten to the point where they're ready to do treatment. And it was really difficult to make all the calls that I could make. Like, I consider myself a pretty resourceful person. I can work the system, I'm a journalist and a college graduate. Like, I can figure it out, but I could not find bed space for my loved one who was a lifelong addict and was ready to go into treatment. And so, if you have somebody in that situation that you want to help, I'm going to assume that your advice would be to get on the phone as soon as possible and get on the waiting list, because those waiting lists are not short.
They're not. Sometimes they are. It just depends. Like if someone came into withdrawal management, also known as detox at DePaul treatment today, I wouldn't know whether we had space in residential for them because it depends on when that withdrawal management is done and who has cycled out of residential during the time they're there. So it's possible they could get a bed, but still, it's possible they couldn't. And so absolutely, I would say be resourceful, be persistent, hold out hope, and just continually remind yourself and your loved one why you're doing this. I had someone who came in a couple days ago. I was admitting them into withdrawal management, also known as detox, and they said they weren't going to come in. Like they just decided they were going to get turned away. It wasn't worth it. And a friend of theirs got them up, got them to our door. And then at 7:30 in the morning, another friend of theirs called and said, "Did you make it?" And they said, "Yes." And the friend said, "Great," and hung up the phone. And so I think having that community of support, but also being persistent, just continuing to work on it. It's so hard because that window where people are like, okay, I want to make a change.
Yep.
It can slam shut. But if you can just keep remembering, this is why we're doing this. I care about this person, and we're gonna keep working on it together, and we're gonna get through this. That's the key.
Last question. Have you seen the phone ringing more within this last year, with people coming to you and acknowledging that they've got an issue and need help?
Yeah. Yes and no. We have seen more people seeking out treatment. We have seen a lot more people with substance use not seeking out treatment. Overdose rates for a lot of substances have gone up significantly. And so it's really both things. More people seeking out treatment, but the overall community of increase in use is much greater than that. And that's the particularly scary thing, is when we're isolated, when we're scared, and we don't have the resources of treatment that we need. That's when people die, whether it's from alcohol use or some other substance. And so we need to increase our treatment availability, and we need to talk about it. We need to say, hey, this COVID thing's really got me. Oh my gosh, I had 3 beers last night. What am I thinking?
That's so true. It's just a healthy conversation to have, and hopefully, we can reduce some of the stigma around it and have grace for one another when we make those acknowledgments to one another as well. All right, Dr. Rieke, anything else that you wanted to add here that I wasn't smart enough to ask you?
I love your comment about having grace for one another. I think that's so important, is if someone comes to you with a comment like that, to be loving and to say, wow, that's hard. That must be really hard. And go back to, what do you want to change, and how can I support you in that change?
Yep, because it's easy to be judgy, and make some offhand comment. It's harder to have grace and sit back and, not try to talk to somebody from your high horse. Well, Dr. Rieke, thank you so much for your advice on this topic, and I hope people really take it to heart.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining me for this episode of That Expert Show. I hope it was helpful to you in some measure. If it was, or if you think that people in your circles would benefit from it, feel free to share this broadly and widely. We put all of our content onto various platforms. It's not only on thatexpertshow.com, but it's on YouTube. We put it out as podcasts as well on Apple and Google Podcasts. And we, of course, post it to our socials on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for Anna Canzano. Always looking for your feedback and your ideas on who we should interview and the topics that we should cover. We'll be creating a tip sheet, as always, based on this interview that summarizes Dr. Rieke's main points, so you can take a look at that after the show as well. Thanks so much for being part of That Expert Show. It really is a two-way conversation. If you think about it, give us a subscribe or a like. That helps others find us, and we'll join you next time on That Expert Show, where you help run the show.